Hi, this is Chris Walker. I almost didn't make this video because, honestly, I thought the supply chain leaks were just the usual early year hype. You know, the OLED killer marketing garbage we hear every single January. But I was wrong. If you are literally about to click buy on a flagship OLED right now, stop. Seriously, take your hand off the mouse. Because what Sony just quietly pushed into production with the Bravia 9 II isn't an evolution. It's an execution. I've spent the last few weeks digging through the leaked panel specs and the true RGB trademark filings, and the reality of what this actually does in a normal, sunlit living room where you actually have to, live, is going to make a lot of people who just bought an OLED very, very frustrated. We're talking filterless, raw luminance, no color washing, no burn-in babysitting. Before we tear into exactly how Sony pulled off this engineering and why this specific design choice changes the entire high-end market, do me a favor, hit like and subscribe. It's the only way I can keep buying these panels out of pocket, skipping the brand-sponsored fluff and telling you what's actually happening behind the glass. So, let's talk about why your OLED might officially be dead. For the last 5 years, walking into a Best Buy or a Costco has been a psychological trap. You walk down that massive aisle and the OLED panels, they always put them right at the front, just look impossible. The blacks are literal ink. The colors punch you right in the optic nerve. And the salesperson tells you with total confidence that OLED is the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. And in a dark room, yeah, they're right. But here's the massive lie of the showroom floor that nobody talks about until it's too late. You don't live in a showroom. I get emails every single week from people who dropped $3,000 on a flagship OLED, got it mounted on their wall, and realized they have to live like vampires just to watch a Sunday afternoon football game without the screen turning into a $3,000 mirror. It's the dirty little secret of the industry. OLED panels use organic materials. They degrade. If you push them too hard, too bright, for too long, they burn in. So to protect themselves from warranty claims, manufacturers use an ABL, an auto brightness limiter.
If you've ever played a snow level on your PS5 or watched a hockey game on an OLED and suddenly the entire screen subtly dims down to a dull grayish blue because the TV is desperately trying not to fry its own pixels, that's the ABL kicking in. It is incredibly distracting. Actually, let me explain that better. It's not just distracting. It fundamentally breaks the illusion of what you paid for. You paid for premium HDR, and the TV is artificially throttling it to survive your living room. The industry knew this. They knew WOLED and even QD-OLED had a ceiling, so they pushed mini-LED as the alternative. Hey, if your room is bright, buy this. It gets blindingly bright. And it did. But traditional mini-LEDs came with its own set of deeply annoying compromises. You'd get blooming, that hazy, glowing halo around white subtitles on black background, and more importantly, the colors washed out. Traditional mini-LEDs shove a massive amount of white or blue light through a series of color filters. When you push 2,000 nits of light through a standard filter, the color volume collapses. Reds start looking pink. Dark greens turn neon. It's exactly why your phone screen looks completely blown out when you step into direct sunlight. We were stuck. You either accepted a dim, fragile TV with perfect contrast, or a blindingly bright, durable TV with compromised colors and hazy blacks. Until February 2026. When the supply chain leaks started dropping about the Sony Bravia 9 II, I honestly ignored them. I've heard the true RGB rumor before, but then the trademark filings hit and the engineering white papers started circulating in the Asian supply chains. Sony didn't just iterate on their backlight, they completely ripped out the foundation of how LCDs have worked for 2 decades. They killed the color filter. Instead of pushing white light through a layer of quantum dots or a standard LCD color matrix, the Bravia 9 II uses millions of microscopic, individually controlled red, green, and blue LEDs right at the backlight level. I want you to think about the sheer processing power required to pull that off. We aren't talking about a few hundred dimming zones anymore. We're talking about approaching 15,000 independent micromanaged clusters of pure colored light.
I finally got my hands on a pre-production unit, and the first thing I noticed wasn't even the picture, it was the physical weight. This thing is an absolute tank. When you look at the back, the heat sinks they've engineered to handle the thermal load of the new MediaTek MT9131 processor and the 4000 nit backlight are massive. I ran a full 100% white window test, which would instantly trigger a massive dimming response on an OLED, and put my hand near the ventilation vents. It was pushing warm air, sure, but it wasn't blistering hot. They've managed the thermal envelope in a way that feels incredibly industrial. It doesn't feel like consumer electronics, it feels like broadcast reference equipment. And the real-world consequence of that filterless RGB design, the color volume is violent. I don't know how else to describe it. When you watch Mad Max Fury Road or play Cyberpunk 2077 in a sun-drenched room, the reds and oranges don't just stay saturated, they hold their purity at luminance levels that would literally force an OLED to shut down. There is zero color wash. But here is where I need to ask you guys a question, and I want you to hit the comments right now. LG and Samsung have spent 3 years gaslighting us, convincing the market that 800 to 1000 nits of full screen brightness is plenty, and that anything more is unnecessary. Are you buying that? Or do you think they were just protecting their OLED margins because they couldn't push the organic tech any further? Let me know, because I think we've been sold a massive compromise. And by the way, I know a lot of you are looking at the other 2026 releases. What do you want me to tear down next? Are we putting the new Samsung QN series on the bench? Or do we need to look at what LG is trying to do to salvage their C series lineup? Drop the exact model numbers down below, and I'll buy the one with the most requests. Because as impressive as Sony's new toy is, we have to talk about the reality of the software, and a very specific, deeply annoying quirk I found in the Bravia 9.2's local dimming algorithm when you actually plug a PS5 into it. Sony has this incredible habit of building the best hardware on the planet and then hiding its true potential behind deeply confusing software menus. If you just plug this TV in, boot up a game, and trust the auto settings, you are entirely wasting your money. The out-of-the-box local dimming algorithm in game mode is overly aggressive. They prioritize absolute latency reduction over backlight accuracy, which means... Wait, let me be specific. In incredibly fast-moving dark scenes, like if you're panning the camera quickly in a dark cave in a game, the true RGB backlight occasionally struggles to keep up with the frame rate, leaving this incredibly faint, almost imperceptible ghosting trail of red and green light for a fraction of a millisecond. It's almost like the processor is thinking too hard. It has to calculate the exact intensity of red, green, and blue for 15,000 zones at 120 frames per second. That is an insane amount of math. And if you don't go into the secondary advanced picture settings and manually adjust the local dimming speed from high to medium, you're going to notice it. Most reviewers won't catch this because they test with slow panning, high bitrate movies. But if you're a competitive gamer, it's there. This brings us to the actual danger of the 2026 market. Sony firing this shot across the bow has panicked the other manufacturers. And when manufacturers panic, they release hardware that isn't quite finished. If that Sony feels like overkill or the early adopter tax is just too offensive to your wallet, this next comparison is where the math actually starts to separate the smart money from the marketing victims. Because right now, you have 3 other massive 2026 flagships fighting for that exact same spot on your wall, and all 3 of them are lying to you in completely different ways. Let's start with the undisputed king of the darkroom, LG. This year, they're pushing the G6 OLED, and the entire marketing campaign is built around their 3rd generation MLA tech, micro lens array. The pitch is simple. We fixed OLED brightness. It's a 3000 nit panel now. And in a 10% window, like a tiny bright explosion in a pitch black scene in Dune, yeah, it looks incredible.
But here is the physical reality of how MLA actually works, and why I frankly do not trust it for a daytime living room. To get that brightness without immediately burning out the organic pixels, LG layered billions of microscopic lenses over the panel to essentially focus and fire the trapped light directly at your face. It's an optical trick. But I've been living with the G6 for 3 weeks, and I noticed something incredibly frustrating. When you put this TV in a room with a large window to your left or right, that MLA layer combined with their new anti-reflective coating introduces this highly unnatural, very faint magenta shift when you sit off-axis. If you're on the far side of the sectional couch, white walls in a commercial or snow in a documentary don't look white. They look slightly bruised. And worse, the ABL is still there. I don't care what the LG rep tells you. I put on a full-screen bright hockey game at 2 p.m. For the first 60 seconds, the ice is pure, brilliant white. The TV is drawing massive power. Go put your hand on the top back edge of that insanely thin metal chassis after a minute of that. It is literally radiating heat. The TV knows it can't sustain that thermal load, so right around the 2-minute mark, you watch the ice just subtly fade to a dull, milky gray. The panel actively throttles your picture to save its own life. You are paying $3,500 for a TV that is terrified of its own peak brightness. So if WOLED is out for a bright room, the obvious pivot is Samsung's QD-OLED, right? The S95F, no white subwhistle, pure quantum dot color. In terms of raw color volume in HDR gaming, it absolutely destroys the LG. It's not even close. But wait, I need you to look closely at this panel before I even turn it on.
Notice that? The TV is off. The LG next to it is pitch black. The Samsung is purple. It's a dark, muddy magenta. Samsung, in their infinite wisdom to maximize light output, completely removed the polarizing filter from these QLED panels. If you have ambient light in your room, a lamp, a window, sunlight bouncing off the floor, that ambient light physically hits the quantum dots inside the screen and excites them. The blacks literally cannot be black unless your room is a cave. You buy an OLED for infinite contrast, and Samsung's engineering choice actively destroys that contrast the second you open your blinds. And look, I have to be brutally honest about Samsung's Tizen operating system. Actually, no, honest isn't the right word. I have to be unforgiving about it. The picture quality is stunning in the dark, but living with this TV day to day is infuriating. You press the settings button on the remote to adjust the brightness, and you wait 1, 2, and then the menu pops up. The bloatware, the forced Samsung TV Plus integration, the sheer sluggishness of the UI on a premium processor is unacceptable. It feels like navigating a $300 budget tablet, not a premium home theater centerpiece. I don't understand how a company that makes some of the fastest smartphones on Earth cannot optimize a basic volume overlay on their most expensive television. Let me know in the comments if your Samsung TV menus have slowed down over time, because every single one I've tested degrades after about 6 months of firmware updates. So, you get sick of OLED compromises, and you look at the traditional mini-LED brute force options. Enter the Hisense UX or the TCL QM89. These are the spec sheet monsters, 10,000 dimming zones, 5,000 nits. The marketing is designed to make you feel stupid for buying anything else. You look at the price, you look at the specs, and it seems like a no-brainer. But specs do not process motion. Specs do not map tone. I want to show you exactly what happens when you cram 10,000 dimming zones into a TV, but cheap out on the silicon brain controlling them. I'm running a standard 4K HDR Starfield test. The Sony Bravia 9 II with its true RGB handles this flawlessly because its MediaTek chip and Sony Cognitive XR processor update the zone states instantly. The Hisense, it's constantly playing catch-up. Look at the trailing bloom. The stars move and the zone behind them stays lit for just a fraction of a second too long because the processor literally cannot do the math fast enough to turn those LEDs off. It creates this smudgy, blocky trail behind fast-moving bright objects. And there's a physical reality here that nobody mentions in written reviews. The thermal expansion. When you push 5,000 nits of standard white LED light through a color filter, it generates immense heat.
Hisense and TCL use a lot of rigid plastics in their back chassis to save weight and cost. After about an hour of watching a bright HDR movie, when you turn the TV off and it starts to cool down, the plastic literally creaks and pops in your living room. I was sitting on my couch at 1 a.m. the other night. The TV had been off for 20 minutes and I kept hearing this popping sound like settled floorboards. It's the TV chassis contracting. This is exactly why Sony's move to true RGB on the Bravia 9 II is so utterly destructive to the rest of the market. Sony didn't try to win a zone count war. They looked at the color filter, the exact thing causing the Hisense to look washed out at peak brightness, the exact thing creating all that excess heat, and they threw it in the trash. By using independent red, green, and blue microscopic LEDs, the Sony doesn't just get bright, it maintains its color saturation at 4,000 nits. When an explosion happens on the Hisense, the core of the fireball clips to pure white because the color filter can't handle the luminance. On the Sony, the core of the fireball is blindingly bright, pure, intense yellow and orange. You actually see the texture of the flame, not just a blob of light. But the Sony is not a perfect machine, and if you are going to drop this kind of money, I need you to know exactly what is going to piss you off when you take it out of the box. First of all, out of the box, the Bravia 9 II looks terrible. I'm not kidding. Because of the new 2026 global energy regulations, Sony ships this TV completely nerfed. The ambient light sensor, the power saving mode, and the local dimming from standard to high are buried in the system menus. And until you go in and manually disable these features, the panel literally limits itself to about 30% of its physical capability.
I actually thought my unit was defective for the first 2 hours. It's borderline deceptive. They build the most advanced backlight on the planet and then software lock it so it can pass an energy certification in Europe and California. And the physical footprint? If you are planning on using a slim fit flush wall mount, forget it. Because they had to engineer those massive heat sinks for the true RGB array. The Bravia 9 II is thick. It's heavy. It sits almost 2.5 inches off the wall even with a recessed mount. It looks like a piece of studio monitor hardware, not a lifestyle art piece. If you want a TV that looks like a painting when it's off, go buy the Samsung frame and accept the garbage picture quality. So we have a WOLED that dims in the sunlight, a QD-OLED that turns purple in the sunlight, a brute force mini-LED that stutters, creaks, and washes out colors, and a massively heavy, incredibly expensive true RGB Sony that forces you to become a menu diving technician just to get what you paid for. This brings us to the final and most important question. Depending on what room you are putting this in and how long you plan to own it, which one of these flaws is actually going to drive you crazy? Because you can't buy perfection this year. You are choosing your preferred poison. If you are trying to figure out which camp you actually belong in, stick with me, because I've broken this down into 3 very specific buyer profiles, and one of them is going to save you about $1,000. So here's how you actually make this decision without ripping your hair out or boxing up an 85-inch TV for a return, which, by the way, is a physical nightmare I wouldn't wish anyone on. You don't buy a TV based on the spec sheet. You buy a TV based on the architectural reality of the room it's going in and your own personal psychological tolerance to annoyance. Let's break this down into the 3 actual buyers that exist in the real world. First, the cinematic cave dweller. If you have a dedicated basement theater room, if you own blackout curtains and you actually use them, if you control every single lumen of ambient light in your environment, then OLED is not dead for you. In fact, if you sit in the dark, you should probably buy the LG G6 or the Samsung S95F, because in a pitch black room, infinite contrast still wins.
But wait, there is a massive catch here that you have to accept. If you go with the Samsung QD-OLED to get that insane color volume, you're taking on the burden of physical maintenance. The anti-reflective coating Samsung uses on the S95F is incredibly delicate. I actually ruined a small catch on a test unit last year. If a kid touches the screen or your dog sneezes on it and you wipe it with anything other than a perfectly clean, dry, high-end microfiber cloth, you will leave a permanent bluish smudge in the coating. It is infuriating. You basically have to treat the panel like a museum artifact. If you can live with that anxiety, and you live in the dark, the QD-OLED is your best pure cinema value. You will get absolute reference-level imaging, provided you never ever leave a news channel ticker on for more than 3 hours. But what if you don't care about absolute reference accuracy? What if you are the brute force buyer? If your living room has giant south-facing windows, you constantly host Super Bowl parties, your kids leave the TV on the Nintendo Switch home screen for 6 hours a day, and you just want a massive, vibrant image without thinking about it, buy the Hisense UX or the TCL QM89. Save the $1,000. Seriously. Let me be totally clear about this. The blooming is there. The processor stutters on fast pans, the plastic chassis creaks like an old ship when it cools down, but 90% of your guests are never going to notice. If you're watching a compressed 720p cable broadcast of a college football game on a Saturday afternoon, you do not need a microscopic true RGB backlight. You just need raw, unfiltered light cannons to fight the sun. Just understand that you are buying a disposable piece of tech. The firmware on these budget brand flagships historically degrades after 2 years. The apps will get sluggish, the internal storage will fill up with cached ad data from their aggressive home screens. You will eventually need to buy an external Apple TV 4K or an NVIDIA Shield just to navigate the menus without losing your mind. But for raw dollar-to-inch ratio, it's the best value brute force option on the market.
And then there is the end game, the best overall, the TV that completely broke the market this year. If you are the uncompromising daytime viewer, if you have the budget and you're tired of babying your electronics, I want you to look at this paused video game screen on the Bravia 9 II. The white UI text is pushing probably 2,500 nits. The background is dark. On an OLED, leaving this screen paused while you go answer the door or make lunch would induce a mild panic attack. You'd be terrified of image retention. On the Hisense, that white text would have a massive glowing blue halo around it that bleeds into the dark background. On the Sony, it is just perfect, razor-sharp white sitting on top of inky black with zero burn-in risk. I left this exact menu paused for 4 hours yesterday while I was running errands. I came back, picked up the controller, and kept playing. No ABL dimming, no screensaver intervention, no permanent damage. The psychological relief of that is massive. You don't realize how much mental energy you spend accommodating an OLED until you switch to a panel that doesn't care what you do to it. This is why Sony's true RGB is the OLED killer. Not because it has better black levels than OLED, it doesn't. OLED physically turns off, you can't beat that. It's because it gets 98% of the way there on black levels, but completely annihilates OLED in color volume, peak brightness, and durability. Actually, let's talk about that durability for a second, because it's the secret sauce nobody is marketing. Without that traditional color filter trapping heat, and with those massive industrial heat sinks Sony bolted onto the back of this thing, the thermal degradation of these LEDs is practically zero. This is a TV you mount on your wall and you don't think about replacing it for a decade. The silicone is overpowered. The backlight is over-engineered. Yes, it's heavy. Yes, the out-of-the-box eco settings are a deceptive, annoying joke that you have to fix immediately. And yes, you have to go into the advanced gaming menus to tweak the local dimming speed if you play competitive shooters, but once you calibrate it, it is a terrifyingly capable machine. It is the first time in 5 years I have looked at a TV and thought, I don't need anything better than this.
We've spent the last half-decade treating OLED like it was the final destination. The industry trained us to accept dimming, to accept burn-in anxiety, to accept aggressive auto-brightness limiters, all because the contrast was worth the pain. But the Bravia 9 II proves that the pain is optional now.
By ripping out the color filter and shrinking the RGB arrays down to the microscopic level, Sony didn't just build a better mini-LED, they made OLED a niche product. They relegated it to the basement home theater. For the rest of us, for the bright living rooms, the Sunday sports, the all-day gaming sessions without drawing the blackout curtains, true RGB is the new standard. Your OLED is technically dead, it just doesn't belong in the living room anymore. I've put together a list of the exact models we tested today, and more importantly, I've linked the specific panel revisions you need to look for, because Samsung and Hisense are notorious for quietly swapping out panel suppliers mid-year. If you want the safe path, check the vetted sources in the description below. They guarantee you don't get stuck with a secondary, lower-tier panel lottery trap. Let me know in the comments if you think Sony's premium tax is actually worth the peace of mind, or if you're perfectly happy drawing the curtains and babying an OLED. I read every single one, and we're going to use your feedback to pick the next teardown. Stay safe out there, protect your wallet, and I'll see you in the next one.